The barracks were alive with noise that morning, boots stomping against the cracked concrete floors, young recruits shouting in half-disciplined rhythm as they rushed to their drills, and laughter echoing through the narrow hallways like the cruel notes of a song. Amid the chaos, she walked in silence. Her uniform, though pressed neatly, hung awkwardly on her thin frame, the sleeves slightly too long, the fabric stiff against her skin. She wasn't tall, she wasn't striking, and her pale face carried none of the hardened confidence of the others. Instead, her quiet demeanor and the faint limp in her left leg made her stand out in all the wrong ways. They called her a joke, a misfit that somehow slipped past the selection process. When she passed through the mess hall that morning, balancing her tray with steady hands, a group of recruits leaned close to each other, whispering, then laughing louder than they needed to. "Look at her," one sneered, "a soldier in name only. She couldn't scare a bird, let alone an enemy." She didn't answer, didn't even lift her eyes. She placed her tray down at the corner table, sat alone, and quietly ate her breakfast while their laughter followed her like shadows she couldn't shake. She had joined the military not because of dreams of glory, nor because she believed herself destined for greatness. Her reasons were simple, almost painfully so: security, a roof over her head, a purpose in a world that had left her with nothing. War had already taken her family years ago. Her village was burned to ash in a border conflict no one remembered anymore. She had survived, carrying scars both visible and hidden, scars that branded her soul with silence. While others signed up with ambition or burning patriotism, she signed up because she had nowhere else to go. Yet the others couldn't see past the surface. To them she was too plain, too fragile, too broken. They mocked her walk, the way she folded her clothes with obsessive neatness, the way she barely spoke unless spoken to. A simple woman pretending to wear a uniform, they thought. They didn't know the nights she spent awake, her mind replaying screams of the past, the smell of smoke, the memory of blood on her hands when she tried to drag her younger brother out of the flames. They didn't know that her limp wasn't weakness, it was a reminder of survival, of crawling through rubble when the building collapsed, of refusing to die when everything around her demanded that she should. Training was crueler than the ridicule. She struggled with the runs, each step of her injured leg burning fire into her muscles, but she never quit. When she stumbled, they laughed. When she failed a push-up, they smirked. When she finished last, they rolled their eyes. Yet every morning she was there again at the line, ready to begin, sweat rolling down her face but her resolve unbroken. It wasn't talent that drove her forward, it was grit, the quiet stubbornness of someone who had already lost everything and had nothing else to bargain with. The instructors noticed her silence but also her refusal to collapse. They didn't praise her, but neither did they dismiss her. She was simply there, a shadow among brighter flames, overlooked and underestimated. And maybe that was her strength all along. That day, however, was different. The general was visiting the training grounds, an event that made every recruit stand straighter, shout louder, and polish their boots until they shone like mirrors. The air buzzed with anticipation as rows of soldiers lined up, waiting for inspection. She stood among them, her eyes fixed forward, hands locked behind her back, her uniform stretched across her scarred shoulders. Her heart pounded in her chest, not because of fear of failure, but because she knew what came with such inspections. The stares, the whispers, the chance for someone to make her the target of a joke in front of the highest authority. The recruits beside her were already exchanging smirks, daring each other with glances. She braced herself for the humiliation she thought was inevitable. The general moved down the line, his presence commanding silence. He was a man carved from war itself, his chest heavy with medals, his expression hard enough to crush the spirit of most. He inspected every detail, the shine of boots, the crease of uniforms, the sharpness of posture. When he reached her, he stopped. The silence that followed was deafening. His eyes, dark and piercing, didn't look at her uniform first. They looked at her face, at the faint scar that ran from her temple down past her jawline, at the burn marks barely hidden beneath the collar of her shirt, at the way her limp betrayed years of pain endured and carried with dignity. The general's gaze lingered, and slowly, with deliberate gravity, he straightened himself and gave her a salute. The other recruits froze in disbelief. A salute from the general was rare, an honor reserved for men and women who had already proven themselves in battle. Yet here it was, directed at the simple woman they mocked every day. She didn't move at first, stunned by the weight of what had just happened. Then she returned the salute with steady hands, her eyes locked on his, her chest rising with the slow realization that her scars, the very marks they mocked, had spoken louder than her silence ever could. The general turned to the others, his voice like steel cutting through the air. "This one," he said, pointing at her, "has known war. Do not mock what you do not understand. Stand at attention. The recruits scrambled into stiffness, their faces pale, their arrogance stripped away in an instant. She stood there, silent as always, but for the first time since she arrived, the silence felt like power, not shame. The air was still tense after the general's words, as if his presence had carved silence into every corner of the training grounds. The recruits who once laughed at her now stood rigid, their smirks erased, their pride punctured. She didn't look at them. Her gaze remained forward, her body steady, but inside her chest something unfamiliar stirred. It wasn't pride, not yet. It was more like a recognition, a faint flicker of worth she had long buried beneath layers of ridicule and self-doubt. That moment of salute felt like the first stone placed on a foundation she had never dared to build. When the inspection ended and the general moved on to his meetings with the officers, the recruits were dismissed. They spilled into groups, whispering again, but their whispers had changed. No longer mocking, no longer careless. Now they spoke with unease, with reluctant respect, with the dawning realization that the woman they thought a mistake was seen differently by the man who embodied everything they wished to become. She returned to the barracks quietly as she always did, but the atmosphere had shifted. No one blocked her path or snickered behind her back. A few even stepped aside, giving her space she was never offered before. She didn't need their approval, but she felt the shift nonetheless. She sat on her bunk, pulled off her boots and stared at her scarred hands. The salute played in her mind again and again, the image of the general's stern face softening for just a breath when he saw her. What? She wondered. Why her when she hadn't achieved anything yet? She had no medals, no victories, no stories to tell beyond survival. Perhaps it was survival itself that mattered. Perhaps the scars that reminded her of fire and rubble told a story louder than words. That night, as the others gathered to play cards or laugh in hushed tones, she stayed by the dim light of her bunk, carefully repairing a tear in her uniform with needle and thread. She always mended her own clothes. Some of the women teased her before, saying she was more suited to a seamstress's shop than a battlefield. But tonight no one said a word. Instead, one of the younger recruits, a boy barely 18 whose voice still cracked when he shouted, sat near her and whispered, "How did you get those scars?" His tone wasn't mocking but curious, almost reverent. She looked at him, considered silence as always, but for some reason answered this time. Her voice was soft but steady. "Fire. When the war came to my village." His eyes widened and he didn't ask more. He simply nodded, as though the single word fire was heavier than any tale he had heard. Days passed and training grew harsher. They were sent to the obstacle course in full gear, mud clinging to their boots, sweat pouring down their faces. She stumbled often, her leg betraying her, but she pushed through every fall. Something had changed, not only in her but in the way others looked at her. When she crawled under barbed wire, grit sticking to her skin, the laughter didn't follow. When she struggled to climb the wall, 2 recruits offered their hands, not mockery. Reluctant respect was blooming into reluctant camaraderie, though she neither asked for it nor relied on it. She still moved quietly, ate alone, spoke little. But her silence now seemed less like weakness and more like gravity, pulling the attention of those around her without trying. The general returned a week later, this time not for inspection, but for a demonstration of combat readiness. He stood beside the instructors, his eyes sharp as the recruits faced their drills. One by one they fought in mock battles, sparring with rifles and bayonets, their bodies clashing in the dirt under the weight of his watchful gaze. She waited her turn, knowing eyes would be on her again. The recruit she faced was one of the loudest voices that had once mocked her, a tall man with broad shoulders who smirked as they circled each other. But his smirk didn't carry the same confidence it once did. It was strained, uncertain, as though he already feared what he didn't understand. The whistle blew and the fight began. He lunged quickly, expecting her limp to slow her, but she sidestepped with surprising agility, using her smaller frame to weave close. His strikes were powerful, hers measured and sharp. The memory of survival had taught her precision. She wasted no motion, no breath. When he tried to overpower her with brute strength, she shifted her weight, turned his force against him, and sent him sprawling into the dirt. The crowd gasped. She didn't gloat, didn't smile, simply reset her stance, waiting for the whistle to call the round. The general's expression didn't change, but his eyes lingered, sharp with approval. When the spar ended and her opponent limped away with mud on his face, she saluted once again. The general returned it just as he had before. Whispers spread faster this time, no longer laced with disbelief but with something more dangerous, belief. They began to see her not as a mistake but as a possibility. The instructors noticed too. She was called forward more often, asked to demonstrate drills, pushed harder than the rest. Her silence and scars had become symbols, her resilience a lesson unspoken. She didn't seek this role, didn't want the attention, but it came regardless. And for the first time, she began to feel that perhaps the uniform she wore was no longer just fabric draped over an outcast. Perhaps it was becoming hers in truth. The transformation wasn't immediate, but it was undeniable. Where once there had been open ridicule, now there was silence, and where silence had lingered, respect began to take root. Yet with respect came expectation, and expectation was often heavier than mockery. She felt it pressing on her each morning as she laced her boots, each evening as she cleaned her rifle. They watched her now not to laugh but to learn. The recruits who once mocked her scars now traced their own bruises and wondered if they too might one day carry the weight of survival. She did not welcome the attention. It felt strange, like a spotlight cast on someone who had spent her life blending into shadows. Still, she bore it the same way she bore the pain in her leg, with quiet determination. Her days became harder. The instructors, sensing the shift, refused to let her fade into the background any longer. They pushed her to the front of the line, demanded more from her than anyone else. When others collapsed after a grueling run, they ordered her to keep moving. When others complained of sore muscles, they told her to push harder. The recruits whispered that she was being tested, that the instructors wanted to see if the general's salute was a fluke or a revelation. She never asked for the test, never sought glory, but she accepted it with the same silence she carried into everything else. She did not need to prove herself to them, but she did need to prove to herself that she was more than just a survivor clinging to old wounds. One evening, after a particularly brutal training exercise, she sat on the edge of her bunk, sweat dripping down her face, her chest aching with each breath. Across the barracks, the tall recruit she had defeated in the spar approached her. His pride was still bruised, but his arrogance had dimmed. He stood awkwardly, as if unsure of how to speak to her. Finally he muttered, "You fight like someone who's been in real battles." She looked up, her expression calm but her eyes sharp. "I don't fight," she said quietly. "I survive." He didn't answer, but the words struck him harder than any blow she had delivered. From that day on, his smirks were gone, replaced by a kind of grudging respect that spread among the others like wildfire. It was during the night marches that her past came back to haunt her most. The sound of boots in rhythm, the distant crack of simulated gunfire, the smell of smoke from controlled fires, all of it clawed at her memories, pulling her back to the night when her village burned. She could see it in her mind, as vivid as the stars above them. Flames devouring roofs, children screaming, her brother's hand slipping from hers as the building collapsed. The pain surged in her chest, but she never faltered. She marched on, her face unreadable, her steps steady. The others, seeing her strength in the darkness, drew courage from it. They whispered to each other that if she could keep marching, then so could they. The general appeared again, this time without warning, watching from the shadows as they endured a punishing endurance drill. The recruits staggered, some falling to their knees, others gasping for air. She pushed forward, each breath sharp, her body screaming at her to stop, but she refused. Her scars burned as if the fire had returned, her limp grew heavier, but she kept moving. When she finally collapsed across the finish line, her hands trembling in the dirt, the general stepped forward. The silence that followed was heavy, the kind of silence that made hearts pound in fear. He looked at her, then at the others. His voice was calm, but it carried the weight of a storm. "This is what it means to wear the uniform," he said. "Not strength without struggle, but strength through struggle. Remember that." That night, the recruits gathered around her bunk for the first time. They asked her to tell her story, not out of curiosity but out of respect. She hesitated, the memories pressing against her like broken glass. But she spoke, haltingly at first, then with the steady rhythm of truth. She told them of the night her world ended, of how she crawled through rubble with her legs shattered, of how she carried scars not as trophies but as burdens. She told them of her brother's scream, the silence that followed, and the vow she made never to let his death be meaningless. When she finished, the room was silent. No one laughed, no one smirked. Some lowered their heads, others clenched their fists. They had mocked her for being simple, but in her simplicity lay a strength none of them could match. From then on, she was no longer alone. They trained beside her, supported her when her leg gave out, matched her silence with their own determination. She didn't seek their friendship, but it came anyway, forged in the fire of respect. The instructors noticed, the general noticed, and perhaps even she noticed, though she never admitted it aloud. Her scars had become more than just remnants of pain, They had become symbols of survival, of resilience, of what it truly meant to endure. And though she still considered herself nothing more than a simple woman, the others began to see her as something far greater. Weeks passed, and the rhythm of the camp shifted around her presence. What began as ridicule had transformed into respect, and what grew from respect slowly blossomed into something stronger, a unity she had never expected to find. The recruits, once eager to mock her silence, now sought her out during drills, measured their strength against her endurance, and tested their courage beside hers. She never asked to lead, never raised her voice to command, yet leadership began to form around her like a shadow cast by fire. Even the instructors, stern and unrelenting, began to use her as an example. When others faltered, they pointed to her and said, "Look there. That is how you endure." She felt the weight of these unspoken expectations pressing harder than any rifle across her back, but she bore it without complaint. After all, she had been carrying heavier burdens for years. One evening, while the sun dipped low and painted the horizon in blood-red light, the general summoned her. The order came quietly through an instructor, but it carried the gravity of thunder. She followed without hesitation, her boots crunching against the gravel as the shadows lengthened. The general waited near the edge of the training grounds, his hands clasped behind his back, his face unreadable. For a moment he said nothing, only studied her in silence. The weight of his gaze was almost unbearable, but she stood firm, her posture straight, her eyes forward. Finally his voice broke the stillness, deep and steady. "You carry scars as though they were medals. Do you know why I saluted you that day?" She hesitated, unsure if she was meant to answer, but when his eyes narrowed slightly she spoke. "Because scars mean survival, sir." The general's lips tightened, almost into a smile but not quite. "Correct. But survival alone is not enough. A soldier survives for others, not only for themselves. Do you understand?" She nodded, though in her chest the words twisted with weight. Survive for others. She had survived for her brother once but failed him. Could she truly bear the weight of others now? The general studied her longer, then stepped closer. "War is not about glory. It is about endurance. I saw in you the face of endurance, and I will see if it can lead." Without another word, he dismissed her, but his silence spoke louder than orders. He wasn't simply watching her anymore, he was preparing her. The following days proved his intent. During drills she was placed at the front of squads. During marches she was made to set the pace. During sparring she was no longer paired with ordinary recruits, but with the strongest among them. Every task was heavier, every order sharper. Some recruits grumbled, thinking she was being favored, but most knew she was being tested more than anyone else. She never asked why, never complained, never broke under the strain. And as they followed her through mud, through sweat, through the sting of failure and the ache of exhaustion, the others discovered that her silence was not emptiness, it was discipline. She didn't need to shout to inspire. She endured, and they endured with her. It was on a stormy night, rain lashing against the training grounds, when the final measure of their unity was tested. The recruits were ordered into a night exercise, navigate the flooded obstacle course and secure the objective on the far end. The storm was merciless, wind tearing at their uniforms, mud sucking at their boots, thunder shaking the ground beneath them. Many faltered, slipping in the muck, blinded by sheets of rain. But she pressed forward, her limp heavier than ever, her muscles burning with every step. And when one of the younger recruits fell, swept into the mud by rushing water, she turned back without hesitation. Her hands gripped his arm, her body anchoring against the current, pulling him free. Her scars burned as the cold tore at her flesh, but she dragged him until his feet found solid ground. The squad saw this, and in that moment they rallied, not behind orders, not behind instructors, but behind her. They formed a chain, each pulling the other, each pressing forward through the storm, driven not by fear of punishment but by the determination to match her endurance. By dawn, soaked to the bone and covered in mud, the squad stumbled across the finish line. The instructors looked at them with surprise, for few squads had finished intact. The general stood in the distance, his silhouette outlined by the rising sun. His eyes fell on her, and though he said nothing, she understood. She had proven not only survival but leadership, the kind that demanded no words, no glory, only the unbreakable will to endure and pull others with her. Later that morning, when the recruits gathered in the mess hall, no one sat apart from her. They crowded around, sharing stories, laughing softly, their unity undeniable. The tall recruit who once mocked her now sat across from her, his face open with respect. "You could have left me behind," the younger boy whispered, still shaken from nearly drowning. She shook her head. A soldier doesn't survive alone, she said simply. The words hung in the air, heavy and true. For the first time, she felt a flicker of something she had not dared to feel in years. Belonging. Word of her transformation began to spread beyond the boundaries of the training camp. Soldiers who had never spoken her name now whispered about the woman with the limp who endured every trial without complaint, who bore scars like armor, who led not with shouts but with example. At first, it was only rumor, a tale carried by recruits who swore they saw her pull another from the flood, or defeat a larger opponent with precision instead of power. But soon the stories reached officers, and even the general's staff began to murmur about her. Some doubted, dismissing the tales as exaggeration born from the romanticism of green recruits. Others grew curious, wondering if perhaps the whispers carried truth. To her, none of it mattered. She still woke each morning to the ache of her leg, still scrubbed mud from her boots, still carried her silence like a shield. She hadn't sought recognition before and she didn't crave it now. But recognition came nonetheless, uninvited and undeniable. The general's interest grew sharper. She was called more frequently to demonstrate in front of groups, ordered to repeat drills under heavier burdens while others watched. At times, she could feel resentment flicker in the eyes of her peers, the old jealousy of those who believed she had been chosen unfairly. Yet when her scars caught the light, when her limps slowed her but did not stop her, when her silence held steady against exhaustion, that resentment always gave way to reluctant admiration. She didn't pretend to be better than them. She didn't boast. She simply endured, and that endurance became impossible to ignore. But admiration brought with it a new kind of challenge, responsibility. She found herself sought out not only in training but in the small, fragile hours of the night, when recruits whispered confessions they could share with no one else. One admitted he feared he would never be strong enough, that his arms trembled when he lifted his rifle. Another confessed he couldn't sleep because nightmares of his village's destruction haunted him. A third whispered about the shame of wanting to quit. To each, she listened quietly. She didn't offer grand speeches, didn't try to erase their fears with hollow encouragement. Instead, she told them simple truths. Strength is built one breath at a time. Nightmares mean you've survived something worth remembering. Quitting doesn't end pain. Enduring changes it. Her words were plain, stripped of poetry, but they came from the weight of lived scars, and so they carried more power than any slogan painted on a wall. Still, doubt lived within her. She often lay awake, staring at the ceiling of the barracks, wondering if she was becoming something she had never intended to be. Was she truly a leader, or simply a figure others clung to because they saw their own pain reflected in her? The general's words echoed in her memory, "A soldier survives for others." But had she not failed that once before? Her brother's face appeared in the darkness, the memory of his scream carved deep into her bones. She clenched her fists against the weight of it, whispering silently into the night, "I won't fail again." The next test came not from training but from reality. The border grew restless and the threat of violence loomed nearer. Skirmishes broke out along the edges of contested territory, small and brutal. The recruits, once shielded from such things, were told they would soon be deployed, not into full war, but into patrols where danger was real and survival uncertain. Fear swept through the camp like cold wind. Some tried to mask it with bravado, others with laughter, but beneath it all was the same unspoken dread. The training was ending and the true trial was about to begin. When they gathered on the field for deployment orders, the general addressed them personally. His words were sharp, cutting through the unease. War does not care if you are ready. It does not wait for you to be strong. It comes when it chooses and it takes what it will. You will meet it soon. The only question is whether you will endure. His eyes swept across the recruits before landing on her. "And endurance," he said, his voice deliberate, "is already among you." The recruits turned their eyes to her, not with mockery now, but with something heavier, expectation. She felt the weight of their stares press into her chest like a stone. She hadn't asked for this role, but it had been given to her nonetheless. That night, as they prepared their gear, she moved among them quietly. She checked straps, adjusted rifles, and offered steady nods when fear glimmered in their eyes. She said little, but her presence spoke enough. The boy she had pulled from the mud clung closest to her, his hands trembling as he packed his kit. "I don't want to die," he whispered. She looked at him, her expression calm though her own fears gnawed at her heart. "Then live," she said simply. "Live by holding on one step at a time." The boy nodded, tears mixing with determination. In the stillness before dawn, as the sky turned pale with the promise of departure, she stood at the edge of the camp, staring into the horizon. The uniform that once felt awkward now clung to her like a second skin. The scars that once marked her as an outsider now marked her as something else, an emblem of survival. The recruits filed in behind her, their steps uncertain but steadier for her presence. The general watched from a distance, his eyes sharp as if measuring the weight of the soldier she had become. She was still a simple woman, still scarred, still silent. But now, when she stood at attention, others stood straighter too, as though her silence alone commanded it. And as they marched toward the unknown, she knew this truth: survival was no longer hers alone. It belonged to them all. The morning after the brutal training exercise, the base was unusually quiet. Soldiers moved about in hushed tones, their gazes heavy with the memory of the night before. What had been intended as a test of strength and willpower had turned into a moment that would ripple across every barracks, every corridor. Clara, the woman they once dismissed as insignificant, had walked through the fire of their disdain and emerged with a force none of them had anticipated. But the air was heavy, not with mockery now, but with an unspoken respect that lingered in every glance cast her way. Clara woke before dawn as always, though her body ached with the kind of pain that came from both scars long healed and new bruises from the relentless training. She did not complain. She never did. For her, pain was familiar, almost an old companion she carried silently. She dressed slowly, pulling on her uniform with deliberate care, smoothing the fabric over her chest and straightening the sleeves. When she caught her reflection in the small cracked mirror above her cot, she paused for a moment. The scars traced faintly across her face and neck, shadows of battles from a past few understood. Where once she had hidden them with shame, now they felt like armor, proof that she had endured. Proof she was not fragile, not weak, but carved out of survival. As she walked to the mess hall, she noticed the shift. Conversations quieted slightly as she passed, though no one dared mock her anymore. Their silence carried a strange weight, as if each of them now saw something in her they had missed. One soldier, the same one who had laughed cruelly during her first week at the base, lowered his eyes as she approached. Clara didn't smile, didn't gloat. She simply walked past him, her steps steady, her posture unyielding. The strength of a soldier was not in shouting victory, she thought, but in enduring without needing the world's approval. But the test was far from over. Later that day, the general himself summoned her. It was rare, almost unheard of, for someone of her rank and perceived insignificance to stand before the man who commanded hundreds, perhaps thousands, of soldiers. Clara walked into the briefing room, her boots echoing softly against the polished floor, and there he stood, General Hargrove, a man whose presence seemed to dominate the air itself. His uniform was immaculate, his chest lined with medals that told stories of wars Clara had only read about. His gaze was sharp, unflinching, the kind of stare that could cut through any pretense. "Private Clara," he said, his voice steady, carrying both authority and curiosity. "I've been hearing reports. Last night, during the endurance test, it seems you held longer than most." "Yes, sir," Clara replied, her voice calm, steady. She did not fidget, did not let her eyes fall to the floor. She looked at him directly, though never with arrogance. The general studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. "I also heard," he continued slowly, "that you did not falter even when you were left isolated. That when others abandoned their positions you stood firm. Is this true?" "Yes, sir." Something flickered in his eyes, a spark of interest. "And why? Why did you not yield when others, stronger in build, more seasoned in years, gave in?" Clara's jaw tightened slightly. She could have said many things, spoken of pride or the desire to prove herself, but she chose the truth. "Because, sir, I know what it means to be left behind. I've survived battles outside this uniform, battles that don't earn medals or recognition. I stood firm because if I gave in, then every scar I carry would mean nothing. I won't dishonor what I've already survived." The room fell silent. The general regarded her not as a mere private, not as a woman mocked for her scars, but as a soldier who understood endurance in its purest form. Slowly, with a movement that caused every officer present to straighten in disbelief, the general gave a single nod, sharp, deliberate. He rose from his seat and, to the shock of everyone watching, stood at attention before her. The act was brief, but in the rigid world of the military, it carried weight beyond measure. A general did not stand at attention for a private, not unless that private had shown something extraordinary. The other officers exchanged glances, their eyes wide with disbelief. Clara did not let her expression change, though inside her chest, her heart thundered like a drum. She did not mistake the moment as approval or flattery. No, it was acknowledgement, the kind that could never be mocked, never erased. When the general finally dismissed her, she left the room with her head high, her steps as steady as when she had entered. But something had changed now. The whispers outside were different. Not ridicule, not scorn, but reverence, even awe. Soldiers who once jeered at her scars now saw them for what they truly were. The history of someone who had endured more than most could fathom. That evening, as Clara returned to her cot, she sat in silence, staring at her hands. They trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the enormity of what had just transpired. She was still the same woman who had arrived at the base weeks ago, mocked for being simple, dismissed as fragile. Yet now, in the eyes of her peers and her superiors, she was something else entirely. And though the weight of her past still lingered for the first time in years, Clara felt something she thought she had lost long ago: hope. The next morning came like the slow lifting of a veil, with mist curling over the training grounds and the metallic echo of boots on concrete filling the air. Elena was already awake, her uniform pressed with meticulous care, her hair tied back in a strict bun that revealed the hard lines of her face and the scars that had become both her shield and her weapon. The whispers were quieter now, different in tone, no longer dripping with mockery but edged with curiosity and reluctant respect. As she walked through the ranks, soldiers straightened their posture, their eyes lingering just a second longer than before. It wasn't fear that passed between them but something deeper: acknowledgement. For the first time since her arrival, she felt the subtle shift in the current of the air around her, a silent acceptance that she had earned by grit, not by begging for it. Yet Elena knew respect was fickle. She had lived long enough to understand that admiration could vanish as quickly as it appeared, burned away by failure or weakness. And so she did not allow herself to bask in it. Instead, she sharpened her focus, throwing herself into drills with an intensity that unsettled even her instructors. Her body carried aches from the previous day, every scar pulling taut with each motion, but she welcomed the pain. Pain was proof she was still alive, proof that she had survived battles greater than this camp could ever throw at her. It was a reminder to the others that she was not a fragile storybook heroine but a soldier forged in fire. Her reputation spread beyond the barracks soon enough. In the mess hall, conversations paused when she entered, not in ridicule now but in anticipation. The story of the scarred woman who had silenced a room of mockers and forced the general himself to stand in her presence traveled through the ranks like wildfire. Some embellished the tale, speaking of duels she had fought, of impossible odds she had overcome. Elena listened to none of it. She neither confirmed nor denied their stories, because she understood something most did not. Mystery was stronger than truth. Let them wonder. Let them imagine. That uncertainty would keep them watching her, waiting to see what she would do next. The general, too, kept a careful eye on her. Elena noticed his presence more often, the way he lingered at the edge of drills, his gaze settling on her with a weight that carried both expectation and a strange kind of pride. He never spoke much, never offered her praise outright, but his actions told their own story. When the best equipment was handed out, Elena received it. When selections for specialized missions were made, her name was on the list. Others grumbled in private, but none dared to challenge it openly. They had seen the shift in command, the subtle endorsement of her abilities by the man at the very top. Still, Elena did not grow complacent. At night, when the camp fell into uneasy silence, she lay awake staring at the ceiling of her bunk, her mind replaying every insult, every moment of humiliation that had been carved into her memory since the day she first put on the uniform. Those memories were fuel, burning hotter than any praise. She could not forget them, and in truth she did not want to. They were her reminders of why she could never falter. She knew the world still waited for her to stumble, for proof that she was not deserving of the place she had clawed her way into. She would not give them that satisfaction. One evening, after a brutal day of obstacle courses and live-fire exercises, Elena was called into the command tent. The air was heavy with the scent of coffee and dust, the canvas walls glowing faintly under lantern light. The general sat behind a table, papers spread before him, his sharp eyes lifting to meet hers as she entered. He didn't motion for her to sit. Instead, he studied her with the kind of silence that felt like a test in itself. Finally he spoke, his voice low but commanding. "Do you understand what you've done here?" he asked. Elena kept her posture straight, her chin high. "I've proven I belong," she replied evenly. A flicker of something crossed his face, approval, perhaps, or amusement. "Belonging was the easy part," he said. "What comes next will demand more than scars and willpower. It will demand that you lead." The weight of his words pressed heavily against her, but she did not flinch. Leadership was not something she had sought, but perhaps it was the path carved for her all along. She thought back to the laughter, the sneers, the way they had dismissed her. To lead them now would not just be a challenge of authority, it would be a battle of loyalty, of trust. Could those who had mocked her follow her into fire? Could she command the very voices that once called her weak? The answer, she realized, was not for them to decide. It was for her to prove. When she left the tent, the night was quiet except for the distant hum of machinery. Elena inhaled deeply, letting the cool air fill her lungs. The general's words echoed in her mind like a drumbeat. More than scars, more than willpower, leadership. She clenched her fists, feeling the old ache ripple across her skin. Tomorrow she would begin again. Tomorrow she would show them not just the strength to endure but the strength to lead. The path ahead was steeper, the challenges sharper, but Elena welcomed them with the same fire that had carried her this far. The base remained unusually quiet after the court-martial, though for Elena it was not silence of weakness but silence of respect. Soldiers who once mocked her scars now stood straighter when she passed. Whispers still followed her, but they had shifted. They no longer carried mockery, only awe. She did not bask in it, nor did she let pride overwhelm her. For her, nothing had truly changed inside. She was still the same woman who had carried fire and blood on her skin, still the same fighter who had chosen to stand when others would have broken. But she understood now that the scars on her face and body had become something larger, symbols that the entire unit had absorbed into their own marrow. She was no longer simply the soldier they teased. She had become proof of endurance, proof that pain could be transformed into strength. The general had been right. The scars had demanded attention, and not because of ugliness but because of truth. In the weeks that followed, new recruits arrived. She noticed how they stared at her the same way the others once had, their eyes lingering, searching for weakness, searching for a chance to prove themselves stronger. She did not flinch beneath their gaze. The veterans, those who had once mocked her, now silenced the whispers before they even grew. That woman, one sergeant told a new recruit in Alara's hearing, took a burning field alone and dragged 6 men out. You'll keep your mouth shut until you've done the same. The recruit paled and nodded, and Alara said nothing. She had learned that real authority required no shouting. The scars spoke for her now, and they spoke louder than words ever could. Still, Alara did not let the growing reverence turn her into stone. She continued to work harder than anyone else. She woke before dawn, training until sweat drenched her uniform, showing no mercy to her body even when old injuries ached. She corrected recruits with calm precision, her voice neither cruel nor gentle but firm, undeniable. She was determined that her respect would not rest only on the weight of scars. It would be reinforced daily by discipline, by relentless skill, by showing every soldier what it meant to fight with heart unyielding. Some evenings, after drills, she would catch the general watching from a distance, arms folded, eyes hard yet approving. He no longer needed to order respect into his men. Alara had earned it, and she carried it without arrogance. When a new mission came, more dangerous than any before, Alara was chosen to lead the first squad. It was not only a test of her skill but of her ability to command men and women who had once refused to even walk beside her. As they prepared to deploy, the soldiers looked at her not as a burden but as a shield, and she could see the trust etched on their faces. She remembered the days when laughter had followed her through the barracks, and she almost smiled at the transformation. Almost. Because she knew war cared nothing for scars, for honor, or for respect. War cared only for survival, and she had no illusions about what awaited them. Still, she carried their trust like a second weapon, sharp and unbreakable. The battle was merciless. Flames rose again, much like the fire that had burned her years before, and the sky split with artillery. Alara moved like she was born for it, leading charges, pulling fallen comrades to cover, shouting commands that cut through chaos like lightning. She did not falter when shrapnel tore at her side. She pressed forward, the heat of her old scars almost pulsing with the rhythm of battle. Her squad followed without hesitation, because in her they saw not fear, not hesitation, but a living embodiment of survival. Each of them fought harder, braver, because they had someone in front of them who had already endured the unimaginable. And when victory finally came, blood-soaked and brutal, it was Alara's figure that emerged first from the smoke, steady, unbroken. The men cheered, not out of ritual but out of something raw, primal, earned. Back at the base, the general assembled the soldiers once more. This time, his salute to Alara was not in solitude. The entire formation snapped their hands up in unison, saluting her as their commander, as their example. Alara felt the weight of their eyes, the force of their acknowledgement, and for a moment, emotion threatened to unsteady her. But she stood firm, spine straight, gaze level. She had not sought this recognition. yet it had found her all the same. She accepted it not for herself but for the lesson carved into her skin, that strength was not the absence of pain, but the mastery of it. That night, when the bass quieted again, she sat alone in her quarters, the dim light falling across her scarred face. She traced the ridges of her skin with a finger, remembering the agony, the despair, the laughter that had once tried to break her. And then she remembered the salute, the general, the soldiers, every single one who had once doubted her. For the first time in years she allowed herself to breathe in peace. The scars no longer felt like chains. They felt like wings. Her journey was not over. War would come again, battles would test her, and blood would stain her hands. But no matter what lay ahead, she knew the truth of who she was. A simple woman once mocked, now unshakable, unbroken, and immortal in the eyes of those she led. The scars had not destroyed her. They had made her eternal.